The book launch of The Welfare State We're In, written by James Bartholomew, was held at the IEA. Acclaimed television documentary filmmaker Martin Durkin spoke about how he had been influenced.
When you read this book, you will see with tragic inevitability how the monstrous welfare system, well-intentioned, we're told, although I'm really beginning to doubt that. Well, for me, before James's book came along, there were critics of the welfare state, but the criticism would be in the form of there are a few scroungers, to which defenders of the welfare state would say, but they're just a few bad apples, or it costs a lot of money, in which case the defenders of the welfare state would say, oh yes, but you're just being mean, rich Tory types who are reluctant to pay for these poor vulnerable people. What Bartholomew's book did really forcefully, more forcefully than had been done before, was to point out that the real victims of the welfare state were the very people who it was supposed to help. The welfare state has damaged ordinary working class people enormously, and the implications, the way he draws out the implications of that, the economic logic of that, the human dimension of the economics, is a terrific job. The full horror of this damned system is in here, and also in here is the way out.
Before understanding the way out, one needs to examine how the system actually evolved.
There were lots of ways in which institutions grew up in the 19th century to meet people's welfare needs. In terms of what we would call social security, the overwhelmingly important institution was the Friendly Society. They grew and grew quite dramatically during the 19th century, to the point where in the early 20th century the vast majority, I think it was 7 out of 8 million industrial workers, were members of a friendly society, and this ensured them against unemployment, invalidity, and in many cases gave them healthcare as well. Meanwhile, in healthcare, you had the growth of charitable hospitals. You had more and more people were subscribing to them, getting involved with them. If you were poor, you did get treated. And there were also some other institutions that were allied to that with different names, which are now obscure to us. And then there were schools were developed by 1870. It was estimated at the time that 96% of children had, I think it was 6 years of education. They learned to read and write, and the levels of literacy soared through the century. So these institutions were growing, they were getting better and thriving, and were extremely important. And this kind of history is forgotten, indeed untold, in normal history books.
What was there before the welfare state was created?
Yes, it's generally assumed by most people who don't know much about the history of this that there was virtually nothing there before the state intervened, that there was no healthcare before the NHS was introduced, whereas every single teaching hospital in London was created before the NHS. What the NHS has done predominantly is close hospitals. And similarly, schools were growing dramatically up to 1870 and beyond. And in all these areas, provision was growing and increasing dramatically.
Some people can become dependent on the welfare state. How did the institutions of welfare that developed in the 19th century Britain deal with such issues?
There were ways in which the welfare state has created what we call perverse incentives. They have created a desire, a lack of urgency of people to get a job, or they have claimed things for which they're not really entitled. Before the welfare state was really introduced, things like friendly societies had inbuilt ways of trying to counter these perverse incentives. They were aware of them. And one of the ways in which it worked was that the Friendly Society was a local organisation. People went to meetings, they knew each other. If you were not working and you were seen, you said you were disabled or something like that, couldn't work because your leg was broken, if you were seen outside, you would be nabbed. Your reputation was at stake. It was a local and mutually enforcing arrangement. And this kind of responsibility, I think, was not only good in terms of making sure that the system wasn't ripped off, it was also good in making a kind of civil society and a sense of mutual responsibility.
What were the ramifications of introducing the welfare state?
Of course, it's true that not everything was perfect before 1945 by any means. Nobody would claim that. It's important to recognise that no welfare system is perfect. If we were to say, was something made better? Was anything made better? Yes, to start with just one thing, I suppose you could argue that coverage became universal. Was anything worse? I believe a whole range of things were worse. And one of the most spectacular things is that mass unemployment became permanent in this country, which it had never been before. In fact, that dates from the 1920s, because the insurance for unemployment began before the 20s and then was raised, and it's following that moment that mass permanent unemployment became a feature of British society, and from 1970 onward became a permanent feature of our society. It was disastrous.
The Labour Party, is widely regarded, implemented William Beveridge's 1942 welfare report. But what would Beveridge have thought of how things turned out?
I think if Beveridge was alive today, he would be shocked, appalled, disgusted by what had happened. The very things he didn't want to happen have happened. One of the things the giants he wanted to get rid of was idleness. And yet idleness is the thing which has been most promoted by the welfare state. Of course, even soon after the 1945 settlement, he was already complaining that it was not what his plan was. His plan was an insurance plan, whereas it became overwhelmingly a means-tested plan which discouraged saving and, in the end, discouraged work.
I think it's generally acknowledged that there is a problem with the welfare state. The difficulty, I think, is that a lot of people think, well, it needs a little bit of reform. What hasn't clicked, I think, is that the whole edifice of the welfare state has done such profound damage that actually we need to unpick the whole thing. The whole project of the welfare state, I think, is questionable. That's what comes across very clearly in Bartholomew's book. It is the welfare state, more than anything else, that has undermined classical liberalism in Britain, and all that went along with classical liberalism, not just low taxes and free trade, but social aspiration, the great mass of people becoming more prosperous, self-reliance, charity, decency, neighbourliness, willingness to work, all sorts of human values as well as economic values. And he depicts terribly well how a society which was decent and going somewhere and proud of itself in a lot of ways has turned into something which is miserable and barbaric and is failing in a lot of ways.